Brave New World. The naval empires of Spain and Portugal had been busy exploring. Columbus had made the grave error of discovering America in 1492. The Portuguese, under the aptly named Prince Henry the Navigator, had been happily navigating up and down the west coast of Africa. Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeo Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and opened up a sea route to India. In order to make sure that everyone played nicely, Pope Alexander issued the decree of Inter Cetera Divina, which drew a line down the Atlantic. Spain had the trading rights to everything west of the line, Portugal to the east. The line was later moved somewhat to the west in 1494 so that the Portuguese could claim Brazil. When this finally came to the attention of other nations, they took no notice of it whatsoever. "I should like to see the clause of Adam's will that excludes me from a share of the globe," said the French king rather grumpily. But it set a precedent that many people around the world were going to regret. It allied the church with colonialism. Because this wasn't just about trade, it was about converting people, whether they wanted to be converted or not. Spanish colonizers conquered South America, taking Catholic religion with them in the form of Franciscan and Dominican missionaries. By 1530, Cortés had trashed the Aztecs in Mexico, and Pizarro had crushed the Incas in Peru. And full-speed conversion was underway. In Mexico, one pair of Franciscans worked a baptism production line, baptizing 200,000 people. Their output peaked at 14,000 in one day. It was easy to see why the natives so readily embraced this new life, mainly because if they didn't, they would have the old life forcibly removed. They were given an ultimatum: become a Christian and be baptized, or lose all your lands and your possessions and become slaves. Although, to tell the truth, even if you did accept this great free offer, you were pretty much a slave anyway. Those who ticked the box marked, "Yes, I'd love to take up my free trial of Christianity and the benefits of European governance," found themselves herded into labour camps, where the joys of learning how to be good Christians were accompanied by disease, foul living conditions, backbreakingly hard work in the mines, and a life expectancy of about 2 years. Still, at least they were saved, so that was all right. The net result of all this was wholesale decimation of the population. Those who weren't killed by the executions and the forced labour were carried off by diseases to which they had no immunity. By 1550, it is estimated that the population of South America had dropped by as much as 95%. The astonishing thing is that many of those involved in these atrocities genuinely believed they were doing God's work by rescuing the natives from vice and superstition. Well, some of them believed that anyway. When Pizarro was reminded about his duty to provide religious instruction for his slaves, he replied, "I have not come for any such reason. I have come to take away their gold." At least he was honest. Columbus believed that God had made him the messenger of the new heaven and new earth, and he showed me the spot where to find it. Those he found living there were less excited. The celebrated explorer was an incredibly cruel and heartless dictator. His slaves had to deliver him a quota of gold, for which they received a copper token. Any slaves who failed to earn their token had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death. Enjoy Columbus Day, everybody. Mind you, we should not romanticize some of the cultures that were overrun. These cultures had engaged in a lot of human sacrifice. Shortly before the Europeans arrived, an estimated 80,000 victims were sacrificed to the gods. As always, it was the poor people at the bottom of the Aztec pyramid who got killed. There were many truly Christian missionaries, though, who were appalled at the mistreatment and suffering. When the Dominican Antonio de Montesinos spoke to a load of Spanish dignitaries in Hispaniola in 1511, he let them have it with both barrels. "You are all in mortal sin, and live and die in it because of the cruelty and tyranny you practice amongst these innocent peoples. Tell me, by what right or justice do you hold that Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude? On what authority have you waged such detestable wars against these peoples, who dwelt quietly and peacefully on their own land? Are these not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? Don't you understand this? Don't you feel this? Why are you sleeping in such profound and lethargic slumber?" Montesinos denied confession to his listeners, one of whom was a labour camp manager called Bartholomew de las Casas, 1484 to 1566. Later, Bartholomew became a Dominican priest, and after witnessing appalling atrocities during the conquest of Cuba, he released his own slaves and spent the rest of his life campaigning for the rights of the natives. When he was Bishop of Chiapas in 1544 to 47, he refused mass to some slave owners, which almost got him lynched. He was a gifted writer and passionate activist who acted as a kind of frontline journalist, sending back to Europe reports of the atrocities and massacres. Later, Protestants started to use these reports as anti-Catholic propaganda, so his books were banned and burnt. But he did manage to persuade the king to pass laws in 1542, restricting the labour camps. He was perhaps the first human rights campaigner in colonial history, and his example inspired many later Catholic priests. Back in Spain, he was called Protector of the Indians. He also managed to influence Pope Paul III, who in 1537 made statements in support of the rights of the natives, declaring that the Indians, like all other peoples, may not be deprived in any way of their freedom or property, even though they do not belong to the religion of Jesus Christ, and can and must enjoy them in freedom and legitimately. Given that by that time millions of them had died and the continent had been divided between the powers, it was perhaps a little late. But good on him anyway. Meanwhile, the Portuguese had made inroads into Africa, or in rivers actually. They had sailed up the Congo and encountered King Nzinga Nku of Congo, whom they baptized and renamed John I. His son, Alfonso, created the Roman Catholic Church of Congo. That's with a K. The country provided slaves for the plantations of the New World, to replace all those South Americans who had ungratefully died of disease in labour camps, acts of Spaniards, and so on. Other Portuguese explorers sailed around Africa and on to India, where they were a bit surprised to find that Christianity had got there first. In India, they discovered the remains of the Nestorian Christians, who claimed that Thomas had brought the gospel to their land. An unverifiable legend, but one that made the Portuguese look like newbies anyway. It didn't stop the Portuguese trying to convert them to Catholicism, though. Elsewhere, Christianity proved itself attractive to those at the bottom end of the scale. Hindu pearl fishers were low-caste members of society who were subject to attacks by the Muslims. They became Christians and put themselves under the protection of the Portuguese. The whole population of between 10,000 and 20,000 living on the east coast of India were baptized in 1536. Must have been a big font. Okay, fact file on Erasmus. Name Erasmus Gerritzoon, i.e. Erasmus, son of Gerard, aka Erasmus Desiderius. Nationality Dutch. Dates 1466 to 1536. Appearance urbane, high cheekbones. The pictures are accurate. Here's a picture. How he's supposed to look. With a turnip on his head, apparently. Before he was famous, scholar, a writer, illegitimate son of a priest. Famous for his edition and translation of the Greek New Testament. And why does he matter? His version of the Greek New Testament formed the basis for translations by people like Luther and Tyndale. His questioning, critical approach heralded modern biblical criticism. Could you have a drink with him down the pub? A glass of sherry, certainly. Come to your senses. Around 1400, only a very small percentage of people could read. But by 1650, literacy rates had soared. As many as 8 out of 10 could read in some cities, which is a higher literacy rate than among tabloid journalists and footballers even today. Even out amongst the yokels, rural literacy might reach 30%. The church recognised that this spelt danger. In Venice, in the late 16th century, a silk worker was denounced to the Inquisition because it was said, "He reads all the time." Women were thought to be especially vulnerable to new ideas, so to protect them, it was recommended that they should not learn to read at all. This is one reason why pictures of the Virgin Mary reading, which were relatively common in the Middle Ages, largely disappear after 1520. Reading was not a respectable habit, not even for the Mother of Jesus. The fact is that nothing liberates people more than reading. When people can read stuff for themselves, they can draw their own conclusions, as can you. They no longer have to believe everything they are told. Christians began to explore the Bible for themselves, and as they did so, they found some puzzling omissions. There was no pope, or patriarch for that matter, no purgatory, no penance. Someone had taken the peas out of the Bible. This, combined with the radical thoughts shared by the wandering preachers on the one hand and the teachers in the university on the other, meant that the pillars of the church were wobbling a bit. And one of the chief pillar wobblers was a man called Erasmus. He was born Erasmus Keretsun, and he was actually the illegitimate son of a humble priest. He became a monk, and soon distinguished himself as a writer, scholar, and satirist. And as the craze for Greek took hold, he rebranded himself Erasmus Desiderius. Desiderius is in fact the Greek version of Erasmus. Erasmus, so good, he renamed himself twice. He was the first superstar of the age of print. He wrote the first printed bestseller, an annotated collection of proverbs, and although an Orthodox Catholic, he satirized the excesses of the Church. His tract, Julius Bard, depicted the then late unlamented Pope Julius arriving at the gates of heaven, only for Peter to tell him that he wasn't on the guest list. In February 1516, Erasmus published the Novum Instrumentum Omne, a Greek New Testament with accompanying Latin translation. This was the first modern critical edition of the New Testament, drawn from a variety of Greek manuscripts. The book unleashed a storm of controversy. He retranslated some of the key terms of the New Testament. The Greek word ecclesia became congregation, or congregation, not church. In John I, Erasmus translated the opening phrase, "In the beginning was the sermon," sermo meaning the spoken word. And every good churchman knew that it was through inflammatory sermons that heresies were promulgated. And then there was the little booby trap of Matthew 3:2. For 1,000 years, the Vulgate text had John the Baptist calling out "Poenitentium agile," to make penance. From this, the Catholic Church had built an enormous system of penances, indulgences, and other ways of making up for bad behaviour. But Erasmus translated it as "Respice," repent, come to your senses. But it got worse. Erasmus based his translation on the earliest Greek manuscripts he could find, and when he examined those manuscripts, he realized that some passages that had always been in the Vulgate were not actually in the earliest Greek text. Bits like the longer ending of Mark's Gospel, and the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. Suddenly, some familiar, well-loved texts were no longer the Word of God. People didn't like this. They didn't want the text questioned and forensically examined in this way. But Erasmus was at the forefront of a number of writers and scholars known as humanists. They were people who had rediscovered the humane literature of ancient classical times. They were people who questioned. It was the humanist scholar Lorenzo Valla who exposed the blatant forgery of the donation of Constantine. They gleefully attacked the superstition of medieval Christianity, with its emphasis on, as they saw it, patently fake relics, the sale of indulgences, ignorant priests mumbling their way through Mass in a language they could barely understand. But for all their cynicism, they were not reformers in the sense of those who came after them. Humanists like Erasmus wanted reform, perhaps, but in a peaceful, humane, reasonable, civilized way. There were limits to his humanity. He was, like so many of his contemporaries, deeply anti-Semitic. "If to hate Jews is to be a good Christian," he wrote, "we are all abundantly Christian." And he wrote admiringly of the French for having banished all the Jews after 1348. But Erasmus wanted ordinary people to read the Bible. He wanted it read by the farmer, the tailor, the mason, the prostitute, the pimp, the traveller, and the Turk. "Do you think that the scriptures are only fit for the perfumed?" He made the mistake of so many civilized liberals. He thought everyone was as civilized as he was. By the time he died in 1536, his approach had been adopted, adapted, and abused by more passionate, more furious, and far less reasonable people, like Luther.